This is Bill 7739. This act would repeal the chapter concerning municipal detention facility corporations that the Rhode Island legislature passed many years ago, and would enact a new chapter prohibiting the operation of private detention facilities and private-public partnerships for the purposes of detention within our state. And the one that we currently have in operation would continue to do so until December 31st, 2029. The act would also further prohibit the housing of Rhode Island prisoners in other states, as well as the holding of out-of-state prisoners in Rhode Island facilities with specific and reasonable exceptions. So to start, I'd like to provide some background on how private prisons came to prominence. When private prisons first began to emerge across the country as part of the war on drugs in the 1980s, inmate populations began to explode. It turned prisons into large, profitable, publicly traded businesses. These businesses have continuously been riddled with issues, as cost-cutting measures seem to always take precedence over safety and quality. With a system that puts profit before justice and incentivizes sometimes dehumanizing conditions, it is a system that's just doomed to fail. We need not look further than the city of Central Falls, which houses our only quasi-municipal detention corporation, the Wyatt Detention Center, to see how the system is not only wrong, but just leads to problem after problem. Safety and security breaches, lack of accountability and oversight, and financial shortfalls are just some of the issues that our local experiment with private prisons has led to. It is important to note that both private prisons and our quasi-municipal system were promised to be the merging of public interest and the interest of the private sector. But it's been a failure, which has really led to bondholders profiting while skimping out on the financial responsibilities that you would expect would be owed to the host community. For context, the Wyatt is not required to pay taxes to the city of Central Falls, and instead they have a separate arrangement that was listed here in the original bill that you have before you. But if they were a standard tax-paying entity, they would have paid the city millions over the past decade, which could have gone to providing programming for our youth, our seniors, infrastructure improvements, or even tax relief for our residents and businesses. But instead, over the past more than 9 years now, they've only made a single payment of $200,000 after the city brought them to court a few years back. But let me be clear, either way, even if they were adhering to their financial responsibilities, to me it's a broken system, and this bill would move to prohibit the operation of private detention facilities and private-public partnerships within our state. Some more information on our quasi-municipal government entity. Recently, they were highlighted in the Projo during the pandemic for their inability to respond adequately to the COVID pandemic, and was criticized by a judge for their general disregard for safety protocol. Going back to 2008, as many of you may be aware, an ICE inmate with cancer died when his complaints about pain went ignored, causing them to actually lose their contract with ICE back in 2008. In 2017, the city was on a complete lockdown after a dangerous prisoner escaped due to lack of staffing. This caused families in Central Falls, Pawtucket, Cumberland, and really all across the Blackstone Valley to have to shelter their children inside their homes or their apartments because a dangerous criminal was running loose on the streets. As the ACLU highlights in their letter of support, even after their demonstrated inability to safely provide for inmates, in 2019, the Wyatt once again took on another ICE contract. But this time, the agreement served to assist the federal government's blatant mistreatment of people fleeing danger and seeking asylum in our country by rounding them up in Arizona and shipping them across the country and placing them in a detention center alongside real criminals like murderers and rapists that are in the Wyatt Detention Center. In an event that garnered national attention, they had a correctional guard run over protesters and others that pepper sprayed protesters in the middle of the street. If you aren't familiar with what I'm talking about, you can easily Google it, and it's absolutely reprehensible behavior. Lastly, and most importantly, they only profit when their cells are full. And to me, that in itself is problem enough. I also know that there isn't a single one of us in here that would want that type of institution in our backyards, sitting less than a mile from your home, near your directly across the street from your high school football field and soccer field, near your workplace, or near where your children play, like it is in my hometown. To me, this is not who we are as Rhode Islanders, and it can easily end with us. And so in closing, I want to highlight that I'd be happy to work with the committee on, one, more clearly defining what constitutes a private prison versus a for-profit prison or detention center, and if need be, work on cleaning up any language to make the goal of ending private prisons, including the one that we have in Central Falls, a reality. I just want to give a quick shout out to Never Again Rhode Island and those that came to testify for just your relentless advocacy and commitment to human dignity. Members of the committee, I ask you to help me say goodbye to private and for-profit prisons in Rhode Island and beyond, and thank you all for your time.
Any questions? Rep. Felix?
Not so much a question, but a comment. I want to thank Rep. Giraldo for your advocacy and for your leadership on this issue. For many years, I've been against private prisons. I've worked in the immigration field and seen how inmates are treated in these for-profit prisons. And this is not something new. This is not a novel idea in terms of banning private prisons and for-profit prisons. We have about, across the country, 22 states that actually don't allow their inmates to be in for-profit prisons because of the conditions and the information that you've given the committee regarding abuse, neglect, straight just mistreatment of inmates. And again, it's all for profit to fill their pockets while our communities suffer as a result of these profiteering companies. So I just want to thank you for your leadership and hope that we can pass this legislation. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Rep. Newberry?
Thank you, Madam Chair. When you brought this bill last year before the committee, I didn't really know much about the issue or the history of it. I thought you made a really compelling presentation last year and today as to why it's a good idea. I also recently was taking the train in from Boston, and it's really striking. The first thing you see as you enter Rhode Island is the prison with the football field right across the street. I mean, it's and I'm sure the city could use that land for a lot of better things. My only question, I remember asking last year about the existing contract. I don't know if the line in here about 2029 was in last year's bill, but obviously I don't want the state to be in a situation where we get sued. But what I don't know, and we don't have the answer here today probably, is what happens, let's say this passes, what happens to the facility itself? In other words, we really need to look at the contract, because if they own the facility, even if we don't renew the lease, can they just sit there and go, well, we're just going to let it sit and rot? You know, we got to find, because the real purpose is to get it out of there and repurpose the land, right?
Yes.
So I want to make sure if this were to pass, we do it in such a way that that actually is the outcome. That's my concern. I don't know the answer to that question, but I just want to bring that up.
Rep. Felix?
Thank you so much. May I offer a little bit of insight? So a lot of states, what they're doing in terms of when they actually ban them is that they convert them either to, because they're rooms, right? They try to convert them. Some have done malls. Some have done actually affordable housing units, repurpose it for affordable housing units, because we know there's a shortage right now. So considering it would be a fantastic way to use the land in terms of being able to house folks, not in the cells, of course, really repossess it, but there's a couple of states that have done things like that with it.
No, I appreciate it. I actually thought about affordable housing, but since Central Falls already well meets the threshold, I didn't want to be the one to point that out. But I think that's a good idea. My concern was more of a legal one. I don't know what the terms of the contract are. Like, we cannot renew the contract, so they can't operate it, but I don't know who owns the facility. You know, I don't know.
Based on my understanding, and I can double check just to be sure, but my understanding is that if this bill was to pass and contracts ceased at this date or any further date, the property itself is property of the city and would return to the city for development that way.
So they'd have the ability to evict someone who is at that point a trespasser, essentially. I mean, it's a legal question which we can't answer, but we do need, if we're going to do this, we need to pin that down. That's, legal counsel can look in, but we need to find that answer.
Thank you.
Rep. Donatone?
Rep,
Yes, sir.
the one question I have, you said you only received $250,000 from the prison. When that prison was going into Central Falls, I mean, most communities don't want a prison in their community, so they try to incentivize it with money. So was Central Falls given any upfront money or anything like that? I mean, why would Central Falls let a prison go into their community that's not going to give them any revenue?
That's a really great question. My understanding is that back in the early 90s when this was first proposed, the original blueprint of the prison itself was much smaller. It was a much smaller prison. There was much less capital that was put in by the bondholders. And so the idea was the bondholders would front the money, the operation would generate revenue, pay back the bondholders, and then eventually be able to pay back the bondholders while also still giving a small payment, not taxes, but sort of like pilot payment to the city during that duration. Some point in the later 90s, early 2000s, the facility went through a massive development and added $100 million worth of debt onto that expansion. It's not exactly clear to me how that was able to pass through, but massive amounts of debt was put into expanding the Wyatt Detention Center into 700 beds. And the problem is that they haven't been functioning well, and they haven't been able to generate a profit. And so what ends up happening is, in terms of how they repay when the Wyatt Detention Corporation facility generates a profit, their first commitment and their overall commitment, based on the way that this was laid out, goes to the bondholders. And so the city is like the last on the list to receive a payment, if anything. And so we went and tried to get a forbearance agreement, and we got one payment in the past 10 years. And then they had a prisoner escape and a whole slew of other issues, and just actually haven't been able to generate enough profit to be able to give the city a payment. So we've gone many, many years without seeing a penny.
All right, so the short answer is they sold you a business model that was supposed to generate profits, and Central Falls was supposed to get a cut out of it, and
Yes.
it never panned out.
Exactly
All
correct.
right.
Yep. Yep.
Any other questions from the committee? Okay, thank you, Rep.
First witness is Sasha Burkoff. And then we have Nancy Green, John Green, Enrique Sanchez, and Santiago Posas.
Santiago had to leave, so.
Okay.
Okay, thank you, Chairman Shanley and members of the committee. My name is Sasha Burkoff, and I am an organizer with Never Again Action, Rhode Island. We're a Jewish-led organization fighting against the persecution, detention, and deportation of immigrants in the United States. And locally, we've been fighting to shut down the Wyatt Detention Center since the summer of 2019. I, like many members of Never Again, first became familiar with the Wyatt in the context of these 2019 protests. Reform of the immigration system is an issue that's particularly close to me as the daughter and granddaughter of Russian and Ukrainian immigrants. I've benefited immensely from my relatives being welcomed into American life, and I find it profoundly unfair that the racialized minorities in ICE jails today around the country are treated as criminals for seeking a better life in the United States, while a family like mine was afforded every opportunity to seek that same better life. As a Rhode Islander, I oppose my state taking part in this unjust system. But this bill isn't specifically about ICE. And as I've taken time to learn more about the Wyatt Detention Center specifically, I've realized that the problems with it extend beyond its participation in the US's immigration and detention system. The Wyatt is a quasi-public, quasi-private prison. Though it is owned by Central Falls, it's run like a private company, and it makes money when the federal government, in this case ICE, the US Marshals, or the Navy, pay to lock people up. The money it makes is supposed to eventually trickle back to the city of Central Falls. We at Never Again oppose for-profit prisons, of which the Wyatt is one, even though it's technically publicly owned. In addition to being a bad deal for governments who employ them, costing as much or more per inmate than publicly owned prisons, private prisons are fundamentally unjust. They cut costs at the expense of inmates' health and safety, and they create incentives to lock more people up for longer sentences, as that increases their profits. As part of my testimony, my written testimony, I submitted a fact sheet about some statistics about private prisons and about the Wyatt in particular, so I'm not going to dwell on statistics in my spoken testimony. But even if not for the existence of the Wyatt in this state, it would be worth, even if not for the existence of the Wyatt in this state, it would be worth passing this bill just to make sure that private prisons, these fundamentally unjust entities, would stay out. But by the same token, even if there weren't fundamental problems with the concept of for-profit prisons, the Wyatt specifically should be shut down. It has been a bad deal from Central Falls from the start. The Wyatt was created back in 1992 under the promise that it would make money for Central Falls. Since then, it has undergone multiple expansions, each time increasing its debt, and which means that the money it makes goes to pay off that debt to bondholders instead of to the city. Despite its supposed financial promise for the city, the Wyatt rarely makes payments to the city of Central Falls, and those that it does make are small. And furthermore, in 2019, when the city of Central Falls tried to exert some home rule, appointing board members who would cancel the Wyatt's contract with ICE, those same bondholders sued the city, forcing them to keep the current ICE contract while litigation is ongoing. The Wyatt has created nothing but problems for Central Falls, and as soon as its current contracts are over, we should stop burdening Central Falls with its presence. But beyond the practical reasons I've enumerated for shutting the Wyatt down, it's very simply the morally right thing to do. It is inhumane to locate a barbed wire enclosed monument to the cruelty of our immigration system in Central Falls, of all places, a city that is over 60% Hispanic and Latine, and over 1/3 first-generation immigrants. Because the Wyatt's contract with ICE specifically houses people detained at the southern border, its presence in Rhode Island contributes to family separation. The people detained at the Wyatt have no particular connection to Rhode Island, and Rhode Islanders detained by ICE are held out of state. The Wyatt also has a long history of keeping its inmates unsafe, as is highlighted by the 2008 case of Hu Lui Ing that will be spoken to in later testimony. And during the COVID-19 pandemic, the latest numbers I could find indicated that there have been over 1,000 positive cases among the inmates. And just keep in mind, this is a facility that only houses between 500 and 600 inmates. And there have been over 1,000 positive cases. And on a personal note, I was at the August 14th, 2019 protest when Captain Thomas Woodworth drove his truck into a crowd of protesters, and other guards followed up this action by attacking the crowd with pepper spray. I saw firsthand the cruelty and disregard for life that employees of the Wyatt displayed. I can only imagine how much worse it is inside the facility, out of the public eye. The Wyatt must be shut down. 3 other states, California, Washington, and Illinois, have passed bills that not only ban all private prisons, but include ICE detention facilities among those private prisons banned. I urge Rhode Island to follow suit. And I'm happy to take any questions.
Thank you very much for your testimony and for your patience tonight. I know it was a long wait. Any questions from members of the committee? Seeing none, thank you again. Next 2 witnesses we have signed up are Nancy Green and then John Green. Welcome, Nancy.
Hi, and thank you for letting me speak. I'm going to be brief and just focus in on the case of Hugh Lee Jason Eng, because his tragic story illustrates everything that's wrong with greasing the skids from a immigration violation to imprisonment, and doing it because profit is the motive. So I'm going to tell exactly what happened to this man who died in Rhode Island. Jason Eng came to the U.S. with his parents when he was 17. He overstayed his visa and remained in the U.S. when his family went back to Hong Kong. He got an education, married an American citizen, and had 2 sons. Wanting to do the right thing, he applied for a green card. When he went to his immigration office for a final interview, he was detained because he missed paperwork that was mailed to a non-existent address. Mr. Eng had no criminal history, he was not a flight risk, and he could have been given a court date to resolve what was basically a paperwork error. Instead, he was arrested, shipped through jails and detention centers in 3 New England states, ending up at the Wyatt. Almost a year later, he was suffering terrible pain from untreated cancer that spread to his spine. He died at Rhode Island Hospital just after his 34th birthday. Mr. Eng's widow and the Rhode Island ACLU filed suit for what they called cruel, inhumane, malicious, and sadistic behavior. This case has always troubled me, and especially because I think I could have potentially been one of the staff at the Wyatt. I was working as a nurse, I was looking for work, and the Wyatt was hiring. And I did a clinical while in nursing school at the ACI Women's Unit, and I was working in a clinic where a lot of people recently out of the ACI would come for their meds and their primary care. So I did get the concept that people need care wherever they are. I wonder now about the nurses that saw this man in terrible pain and didn't do anything. I wonder about all the staff that should have helped him and let him suffer. And one thing I know from working in different environments is that when you have a bad work culture, it starts out with cynicism, and it moves along to ignoring wrongdoing and letting the responsibility be dispersed. So I don't think that the nurses were uniquely sadistic or uniquely perverse in their behavior. They were in a very bad institution, although they bear the responsibility, and I wouldn't sleep at night if I had been one of them. So prison for profit is by nature an evil enterprise. It brings out the worst in people. People do not normally set out to do evil, but they often do much worse things in groups when nobody is really responsible and the system directs them that way. And I think Central Falls is stuck in that system, and Rhode Island is stuck in tolerating this, and we really need to put an end date on this as quickly as possible, get Rhode Island well apart from the business of prison for profit. So thank you.
Thank you very much. And any questions from members of the committee? All right, seeing none, next witness is John Green. Welcome, John. Thank you for your patience tonight.
Oh, no problem. Thank you for giving me this opportunity. In my estimation, America has always displayed a sustained as well as a selective kind of xenophobia with regard to immigration. I find this a shameful and puzzling contradiction, not only because of the words on the lady standing in the harbor, but because the only people in this country who aren't immigrants are those equally diverse indigenous souls we call Indians. And being truly native-born hasn't really worked out well for them. In our history, white Americans have never had to worry about a Fugitive Slave Act robbing them of their autonomy in order to maintain the bottom lines of entitled parasitical slave owners engaged in a monstrous enterprise that placed profits over people. During World War II, I remind you, only Japanese Americans, not their Italian American or German American counterparts, were singled out by an executive order, uprooting them to stateside prison camps for the duration of that conflict. I've heard no politicians today clamoring to build a wall on our northern border. There are no prisons for profit detaining Europeans whose immigrant status may be in question. In many ways, we clearly are not the same, but under the rule of law in a true democracy, we are equal. My point is that profiling and demonizing people because of their ethnicity and vulnerability, and worse yet, making money off it by imprisoning them in Wyatt while the details of their immigration status are sorted out, is like the slave trade, an evil enterprise. Historically, this detention center embodies a toxic business-as-usual blend of collusion, disparity, exploitation, and greed. There simply has to be a better way out of this dilemma. The Wyatt's continuance remains for me an obscene affront to hope, which is, I remind you, our state's motto. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. Any questions from members of the committee? Seeing none, thank you again. Next witness we have signed up is Enrique Sanchez. And then Nathan Levine Asperson will be after Mr. Sanchez. Welcome.
Good evening, everyone. My name is Enrique Sanchez. I'm a teacher at Central High School in Providence and candidate for Rhode Island State Representative District 9. I am here in full support of House Bill 7739 that would ban private detention facilities in Rhode Island and prevent future contracts with the Wyatt Detention Center ultimately being able to close down by 2029. For far too long, private prisons such as the Wyatt Detention Center have perpetuated poverty, inequality, and the school-to-prison pipeline, with our poor communities, our immigrant and undocumented immigrant communities, targeting especially Black and brown folks. The Wyatt Detention Center has inflicted financial and community distress to the city, community members, leaders, and the residents of Central Falls. The Municipal Detention Facility Corporation Law was passed so that institutions like the private prisons would be able to exist only to drive communities into bankruptcy, like it has with Central Falls in the past. Private shareholders, prison propertiers, and ICE have been the only ones to benefit from the Wyatt Detention as an established prison in a community that represents so much diversity, community, and family. Private prisons generate a profit close to $15,000 per person, I believe. And this is a profit that private institutions generate compared to public prisons. There is a soccer field right in front of the prison where families play and gather on Sundays, like the representative mentioned earlier. Community members play soccer on Sundays. Kids play during the weekdays. There are events there weekly throughout the summer. So a lot of diversity, a lot of cultural is brought to that part of the city. I've been there when these events take place, and it feels uncomfortable. It feels uncomfortable because you have families, grandparents, youth playing sports, hanging out with their families, and there is a facility in front of them, which many of them don't really recognize or don't understand what happens in there. People know it's a jail. People know it's a prison, right? But at the end of the day, you know, we have to ask ourselves questions like, you know, do we want prisons like these, private prisons like these across our cities and towns? Do we want private prisons and districts and cities that y'all represent. You know, and unfortunately, Central Falls has to deal with the consequences of this. My family has been doing business in Central Falls for decades now. My grandfather started the first Mexican store in Providence in the 80s. And, you know, we've been doing business with establishments like La Nanita Variety, Monte Cristo Restaurant, Nachos Tacos, Tikal, International Nightclub in Villar, all these establishments, La Milonga, et cetera, in Central Falls. And a lot of undocumented folks come to these businesses. They buy at these businesses, you know, and whenever I hear, or folks that I know, you know, hear of the Wyatt Detention Center, we think of, oh, La Migra, immigration. You know, that's the first thought that comes to people's mind. So, you know, there's two things that we have to take into consideration when we want to try to abolish private prisons in our state. The immigration perspective, right, where, you know, families are separated, but also I think we also have to take into consideration the profit that private prisons generate. And at the end of the day, our state and people who have no relationship to those private prisons, you know, there's no benefit for us. There's no benefit for our constituents, our residents, our taxpayers, Rhode Island taxpayers, and, you know, none of us are winning. The only ones that are winning are the shareholders, prison profiteers, and ICE. So thank you very much, and thank you to the representative for presenting this bill. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Are there any questions from members of the committee? Seeing none, thank you again for your patience. And next we have Nathan Levine Asperson. Welcome. Close? Sorry. I'll try and get it next time if you tell me the correct pronunciation.
I appreciate that, yeah. My name is Nathan Levin Aspenson. It's very intimidating at first glance, but I promise with a little bit of practice, you'll be getting it with no problem. I am speaking tonight in favor of Bill H7739 because I think that Rhode Island should not be home to prisons and detention centers of any kind, and specifically, we need to shut down the Wyatt Detention Center and prevent future for-profit prison institutions like it from springing up in its place. To inform my testimony tonight, I'll let you know that I am in fundraising. My job is to write grants for a local community mental health center. And what that means, in the long and short of it, is that I spend a lot of my time waist deep in data about rates of serious mental illness in various parts of the community and how they are all going up. However bad you think the mental health landscape is and its current position and trend, I promise you it is worse. And so my testimony tonight will relate to the mental health effects that take place upon imprisonment in institutions like the Wyatt. And if that is not enough to sway you, also the mental health effects that happen in the communities surrounding institutions like the Wyatt, where people are removed, where people live nearby, and what effect that has to have that be part of their community. In the general population, the rate of serious mental illness, anxiety, depression, schizotypal disorders, suicidality ranges from about 3 to 5%, although that number is, as I said, going up. In prisons and jails, as well as detention facilities, that figure drops to skyrockets to 16 to 24% of the population of the people imprisoned in that facility. The trauma and mental illness that manifests in nearly a quarter of the residents of detention centers like the Wyatt can become lifelong illnesses, can become debilitating, and often become things that people have to manage for the rest of their lives. All of them visited on a population that has done nothing but be picked up and imprisoned by ICE or one of the other federal agencies contracting the Wyatt. These can again include serious anxiety, depression, even suicidality, and they bring to mind the grim case of cases like Khalif Browder, who, even though they were never convicted of any crime, still very much felt the mental health effects of imprisonment. Importantly, we also see the mental health effects in communities where family separations and detentions take place. Separation of a child from a parent due to deportation is associated with economic hardship, with housing instability, with food insecurity. Following the deportation or imprisonment of a family member, children demonstrate numerous emotional and behavioral challenges, such as eating and sleeping changes, anxiety, sadness, anger, withdrawal. Even if the family is eventually reunited, the consequences of that trauma, of that separation, that deportation or detention, are lasting and continue even if the family is eventually reunited. Nearly 10% of U.S. families with children have at least one member without citizenship, and 5.9 million U.S. citizen children have at least one caregiver who does not have authorization to reside in the United States. And the effects of deportation and detention systems on children who lose a caregiver to one or both are massive, leading to higher marks on clinical depression scales, increased rates of anxiety, even things like a fear of going outside. And Rhode Island's detention center is next to a baseball field. These are our communities that this is having that effect on. These are people who have done nothing wrong but live in the town where they are born or the town where they have sought a life. By allowing private prisons to contract and operate in Rhode Island, we are making our state and local governments business partners in the unprofitable, unwanted, and morally representable practice of imprisonment. There is nothing virtuous that goes on in public prisons, but there is something especially reprehensible about the operation of prisons for profit that have an additional incentive to scoop people up and keep them there with all of the detrimental effects to their life, mental health, well-being, as well as the lives and mental health and well-being of the people in the surrounding communities. I encourage all of you, for these reasons, as well as the other ones you've heard tonight, to look favorably upon this bill.
Thank you very much for your testimony. Any questions from members of the committee? Yes, Representative Agello.
Is this about my name again?
No. Thank you.
Say it a few more times, just that way we get it.
We'll practice it later.
You mentioned 10% of United States families, and then...
That's 10% of children in the United States. It's nearly 10% of U.S. families with children, yes, have at least one member without citizenship. So that's nearly 10% of U.S. families that have at least one child that are mixed immigration status.
Thank you.
Of course.
Thank you. That's
It's a lot.
sobering.
Any other questions or comments from members of the committee?
Thank
Thank
you
you very much.